Hello. Well, I've been taking a break from Facebook. Actually, to do it for Lent, which is 40 days, 6 weeks. I'm about 2 weeks into it. And so I don't know if it's cheating that I'm gonna do a video blog and put it up on YouTube, but here we go. Anyways, I was motivated to do this break off Facebook by I've been getting into this series with Richard Doyle online where he's talking about Philip K. Dick and ultra metacognition. Um, And so a lot of what I've been thinking of is sort of riffing off these ideas that I've been getting from exposure to that stuff. And at the same time, um, me and my friends are sort of getting going a Philip K. Dick book club as well. So I've already been reading, although not, I've been reading different Philip K. Dick books. Although a lot of the stuff he's been going over in his lecture series or online streaming event thing is similar. Oh no, it's books I've read years prior to this. No, I haven't been rereading them; they're on my mind. So the last one they did was Scanner Darkly, and that was an interesting one for me because in my whole course of things happening, 2014 was a big year for me, where I had in 2013, late 2013, I had managed to escape from the psychiatric system somewhat, or they just let me go basically, and I was attempting to come off medication, and in 2014 that process, let's just say it got to be a bit difficult, or some stuff was coming up, and that ended up throwing me back into the psychiatric system again. And I was not really that keen on cooperating with psychiatrists because over the course of the years, I had gotten more involved with stuff like reading Mad in America and the Icarus Project and things like that. And so I was not really one to put up with any bullshit from psychiatrists. And I mean, I could make a channel, hypothetically, that's all about debunking psychiatry or going into all the bullshit around it. But the way I see it is that especially as great there's sites like Mad in America because there's lots of people putting their time and energy into doing just that already. So I feel like, rather than just chiming in and sort of another voice in the choir, I'm coming at things from a slightly different angle. Um, but anyways, one of the things my attention, since the film came out back in, what was it, like 2006, 2007 or something like that? 2005 maybe? I don't know, whatever. Sometime around the mid 2000s. I hadn't really watched it. I watched the movie again and I started reading the book. I didn't actually make it all the way through the book. I found it kind of similar. It was pretty close accurately to the movie, although maybe I should actually get around to reading the book. But my main motivation was that I felt like the whole thing about being in that position was being, because it's like being asked to report on yourself, like you're playing the role of Fred reporting on Bob Arctor. And then more than that, I could see that like this character who I was in this context was a completely separate character from who I really was, whoever that's supposed to be. Um, and So that whole question of identity was raised up a lot in the talk about Scanner Darkly. And I think that is something that I see being a big issue around this stuff of mental health and diagnosis and things like that, because there's the whole question of building an identity around a diagnosis. And I've seen in sort of like the whole PC thing, some people are suggesting to be like, rather than saying, oh, this person is a schizophrenic, to say this is a person living with schizophrenia or something like that. And I'd call bullshit on that straight away, being as this is just playing rhetorical games. For all intents and purposes, whether you're saying a person living with schizophrenia or a schizophrenic, it doesn't really change the situation very much. The whole ideology, this whole story, the narrative around that is essentially exactly the same. It doesn't fucking make a difference at all. So, but what I'm here to say is to point out that, for one thing, when people talk about this stuff, they're talking about it as in, the phenomena of what would play out that gets diagnosed as this or that or whatever. But a lot of people, well, I don't know, a good chunk of people anyways, don't seem to acknowledge the fact that the word that you use to describe it, the label itself, is itself a kind of narrative or a kind of story. And that's another theme in A Scanner Darkly, that is that the power of story and the power of narrative, of people to get really wrapped up in a story, right? And and they're playing off this in kind of drug culture, like maybe, if me and my friends are really stoned and then, I can't find like one of my guitar pedals. And then it's like, oh man, that guy we jammed with the other day, I bet he just made off with it in his backpack, that bastard, he's probably sold it to score some drugs, let's go over to his house right now and let's get that guitar pedal back. And then you could get everybody all riled up in this thing to, to go, everybody's, oh yeah, that bastard, let's go get him kind of thing. And then you don't realize you just bought into a story, and then, maybe right before you, okay, let me just get my jacket, and you get your jacket and you pick it up and there's the guitar, oh shit, there's the guitar pedal. So, and I think I look at mental illness diagnosis kind of the same way, is that people don't have any sort of awareness that they're getting caught up in this big kind of story, right? And then there's this whole thing about like identity basically being like this, it could be either a story we tell about ourselves, or it could be a role that we play in a certain context, right? And so when you're talking about the stigma of mental illness, which I don't like to talk about it because it's so inundated with so much bullshit, is that people generally, if you're talking about mainstream kind of stuff, when they're talking about fighting stigma, they're not trying to fight stigma around the story, basically, right? Which is like, it's also, it completely depends on what diagnosis you're talking about, because this is another thing why it's bullshit, because there's kind of a hierarchy, right? Whereas if you've got anxiety and depression, it's like, oh, well, so many people are struggling with anxiety, depression, it's a normal thing, and we need to blah, blah, blah. But then if you're like, bipolar, it's kind of like, oh, those people might be a bit weird and crazy, or if you're borderline, oh, boo, better watch out for them. And if you're schizophrenic, it's like, oh, God, it's like, as you go down the line, it's sort of like, it's a hierarchy of degraded social status, basically, based on diagnosis. But that whole, so they're trying to say, like, yeah, so this is why I don't like to talk about it, because it's a huge mess, and maybe you can start to see this, is that, like, by saying we don't, there's stigma, is generally this whole story of, like, oh, I have this, and I need to take medication for it, and, I might, whatever, right? It's basically to, remove any obstacles to medication compliance, more or less. But the whole fact that you need to take medication for this, or even that medication is the best solution, is just a story. And so I say, rather than debunking the stigma around the story, why don't we just change the story to something better? Why don't we, and instead of, it's like, rather than completely just coming up with new stories, take the neti approach and just sort of eliminate the idea. If you eliminate what's false, what's true will naturally assert itself, basically. So I'm not really so much interested in just trying to create a new story about this stuff. It might be more accurate to just, remove false stories, and then naturally you see things clearly. Although, of course, there's a bit of a problem with this too, in that, now I tried to look for this in the book, and of course, whatever. With Richard Doyle, he mentioned this quote from A Scanner Darkly where, it'd be great if I could actually find the quote, but it was essentially Bob Arctor / Fred talking about how he's kind of depressed about the situation that he's in, where because the situation in the book is he has to install cameras in his house and watch himself and report and all these kinds of things, and it's a kind of a miserable situation of like total no privacy and surveillance and playing out this role to this drug war, police force, all this kind of thing. But then at the end he says, but at least, it'll give me insight to what goes on in my house, and it'll give me a sense of protection and security, right? And I'm looking at this in another angle where, so with, this whole thing about diagnosis, well, first of all, most people never really have the insight, I suppose. Well, I mean, maybe a lot of people do question it. There's a lot of people who do question it, but the thing is, from my point of view, if you could just say, like, okay, well, what should I identify myself as being bipolar, schizoaffective, schizophrenic, whatever, or just, like, not bother with that, like, just, who cares about that stuff? That sounds like a bum trip anyways, right? Like, to me, it seems like it would be obvious just to say, like, yeah, no thanks, you can try to sell your identity to somebody else kind of thing, right? So why does anybody buy it in the first place, right? Well, the thing is that, so it's like, by having this identity, even if it's miserable, even if your identity is like, I'm disabled, I'm never going to amount to much, if I don't take my meds, I'm like dangerous or something like that, this story, even if the story is a shitty one, from the point of view of ego anyways, at least it's a story. At least you've got something to work with there. You've got a map, you've got like, okay, this is how my life is, this is how to understand this crazy shit that's going on. Even if it sucks, at least it's an answer. Like, people are generally more comfortable with a shitty answer. I mean, shitty in the sense that it's a bad prognosis, basically. Like, people are more comfortable with a bad prognosis than the alternative, which is not to say a good prognosis, but the unknown, right? And that is a big chunk of the human dilemma right there. Is that people, the mind, anyways, well, it's one thing to say people, but this faculty of the mind, which I've also been looking into, like, I mean, I'm no neuroscientist, but there's been talk about the default mode network, right? Which is basically this part of the brain which runs this operating system we call the ego. And the general way that works is that it likes to have concepts and ideas and a story and things like that to sort of stick to and say, I'm Dan Burkett, and I either have this going on or I have that going on, like, this is, to present an image, or to present a sort of, to write something down, to present yourself, this is who I am, and so you can understand me, and we have this. It's like, it's like showing up at the airport with your passport, right? I mean, the passport doesn't actually tell you all that much, I suppose. I don't know if they have, maybe you can print it by a criminal record check or something like that, or these different government files, but it doesn't really tell you much about the person. But okay, this is the person, this is how much they weigh, this is this is their their date of birth. Okay, okay, we've got a passport to get you through this, right? And then so in that sense. But that's just sort of like a basic functionality thing, like having a name and an address, and like Ram Dass would say, just because you're into meditation and expanding your mind, you shouldn't, it doesn't mean you need to forget your postal code or whatever, right? But the thing is, it's sort of like, if you look at things like diagnosis, maybe as a institutional postal code or a phone number, to sort of, categorize people, like, oh, well, we're going to work with this person. Do they live in, on Bipolar Avenue or Schizophrenia Lane or something like that? Well, in that context, it's like you're forced into this position, basically. And that's sort of part of the reason why psychiatry sucks, basically, is because they're kind of, the whole thing is like forcing this identity on you, right? And some people willingly go for it. Some people are like, oh, like even this is like, oh, I have a kind of a difficulty with it's like, I can respect that people have different perspectives, and that doesn't have to be a complete obstacle to interacting and things like that. You can sort of give people room to be where they're at. But if the subject comes up, I don't see eye to eye with these perspectives that are really buy into the identity or solid belief of the narrative of diagnosis. But to me, I see it as, it's like, it's like if you it does provide the sense of security, because if you live on Bipolar Avenue, at least where you're going home at night, kind of thing, right? To use that metaphor. Whereas if you're not situated in any of these housing setups they've got for you, where are you gonna go anyways, right? You're just a drifter. You could. When the thing is, on one hand, you've got the security of knowing who you are, apparently, knowing what's going on, apparently, but then without that, that's. On one hand, it can be scary because you don't know what's going on necessarily. It's the unknown. And like Robert Anton Wilson says, anybody who can positively tell you what it is that's going on is probably bullshitting you, right? Like, if anyone has really just clearly says, oh yeah, this is what it is, then they're the more certainty there is, the more full of shit they probably are, and the more honest people are, the more clear they are, the more ready they might say, like Socrates, all I know is I know nothing, right? But the thing is, you might find that living on Bipolar Avenue or Schizophrenia Lane is a very constrictive thing. There's not much, it's a cramped space. There's not much room to move in those circumstances. Whereas if you just if you move out from there, then who knows where you might end up, basically. And that's kind of what I'm into. But the thing is, there's also this kind of interesting thing that stuff about spiritual emergency is that there's a risk of that just becoming another label itself, basically. Although the thing is, it's generally a better label, I would say. And I mean, I read the Stan Groff compilation book of that name, and especially I really liked the Assagioli article on that. But I found that is actually kind of like, you know, it's sort of like, if you think about this metaphor that I'm using of the street addresses, is it sort of like, well, people keep sending me mail to Bipolar Avenue, but I never get it, you know. It's like, okay, people keep calling my number, but I changed my phone. You know, it's I'm not. They're trying to find me, but I'm not there where they're looking, right? Because if you're looking for somebody who's bipolar, you're not gonna find them here, right? You know what I'm saying? And so, seeing that these things are just, you know, the street that I live on, the name of the street, you know, go back, you know, 100 years, 200 years, then this street wasn't, you know, the street wasn't developed, right? That wasn't built. Like, this area of land was here, but people had a different way of referencing it, right? And now there's a new way of referencing it. And who knows? I mean, you know, like, even cities change their names and stuff like that. But the thing is, if everybody thinks I'm living over there, but really I'm living over here, you know, they're sending, if they think that person who lives on Bipolar Avenue is a certain way, and they're treating him as this certain way or something like that, they're not really dealing with that person at all. You know, it's the message isn't getting delivered, or they think they're talking to somebody, but really it's they're writing letters to their imaginary friend. They're not actually meeting who or what or whatever this entity is that they're actually meaning to address, basically, right? But that's what I was also thinking too. Another Philip K. Dick novel being Ubik. And the thing is, I should probably reread Ubik again, but from what I remember of it, it's kind of a loose kind of metaphor. But there's this whole kind of thing of, like, the idea of entropy is that they find themselves in a world where things are degrading, right? Things start going stale faster and rotten and moldy, and then pretty soon, you know, it would be like the Ubik kind of thing. Like, right now I'm recording this on my iPhone. The Ubik thing would be my iPhone would suddenly turn into an old, you know, tape video camera, right? And then as because time was degrading, and then pretty soon it would be like, you know, it would maybe turn into a person who was writing down what I was saying or something like that, right? And so the time was rapidly degrading, but then in the midst of all this, they'd appear advertisements for the spray can of Ubik. And the spray can, you'd spray on things or spray on your whatever it would be to stop things from degrading so much, right? And then the thing is that it's like they're talking about how Ubik, in this sense, is really because you've got these two different processes: the process of entropy, of things degrading. But then if you think about, like, plant material, if like a plant decomposes, then it goes into the soil and becomes nutrients for something new to be born, kind of thing, right? And to see that, like, you know, I don't, perhaps the Ubik metaphor in that sense is a bit clumsy, but to see as Ubik was kind of emerging out of this degradation as the one sort of saving grace that would help people, right? But what was funny I found about it, why I'm connecting this to the spiritual emergency thing, is that Ubik comes out of this world, degrading world, as a product that's marketed and sold, and itself appears to be degrading in the book. At first it's a spray can, and then it turns into like an old medicine bottle and stuff like that, and whatnot. But the thing is, it's sort of like, in this world that we live in, which is perhaps, you could say, you know, one way of looking at it anyways, a world of narratives and stories and brands and identities and stuff like that, is that if you're looking out there for something that will save you from this kind of, because most people would say, don't look out there, look in here, right? Well, you might look out there for something like it could be the spiritual emergency idea. It's just an idea, but it could point you back to something that would actually help. That doesn't have to do with something you find in a book or something like that. It's like the book leads you back to yourself, and that is kind of not just yourself as in your self-image, the capital S, like Ramana Maharshi self, basically. And so, like, it could be something else. Like, you could say, like, oh, well, I've heard this guy is teaching a mindfulness course, right? And that's basically what this ultra metacognition is. It's basically a fancy way of talking about mindfulness, because I think, or at least how I understand it anyways. Or it could be, like, oh, well, whatever it is. Like, I'd really like to get a healthy lifestyle, and maybe I'll do yoga, and it sort of appears to you as this sort of self-improvement kind of thing in this whole world of marketing and selling and stuff like that. But really, it could be something else coming in through that avenue in disguise to liberate you, basically, from this world we live in, which is all products and stories and identities and all this kind of stuff. And furthermore, what I was finding interesting about Ubik is that I've noticed this thing going on. If you get into the whole social justice kind of thing, well, I don't know, more specifically I'm talking about identity politics, basically. And I thought the Richard Doyle, the last thing that I watched, had a pretty good one about like, there's this whole thing about, like, maybe I'll get in trouble for this, but the whole, like, gender thing, right? About binary genders, and then obviously more conservative types thinks it's ridiculous for people to be inventing, like 72 different new genders or something like that. But the thing with that is sort of like, it sort of comes out of seeing that just sort of portraying yourself as I am a man or I am a woman, as my biology is, this doesn't really give a very accurate representation of how I really feel about myself, or how I really see myself, or how, it doesn't really seem to express me to just be like, oh, well, I'm just like a man like any other man, basically, right? And so people, it's inadequate. And so people are saying, oh, well, we'll come up with some more varieties of identity that sort of, like I'm talking about, schizophrenia drive or bipolar avenue or whatever. It's still just an address. It's still just a zip code. But if the mail isn't getting to person who lives on male lane or female street or something like that, if you have a if you send the mail to genderqueer street or something like that, it might have a better chance of actually getting as an address to kind of point to where you're living. But the thing is, all the addresses are necessarily going to be addresses anyways, and then what we actually are would be completely beyond gender. I mean, even if somebody is completely, it's just the whole. Even if somebody doesn't have any issues, like I don't really, it kind of depends on your conceptions of what gender is. I mean, this is kind of going off topic, but I don't see myself as the most macho kind of dude in the world, but I also don't have I don't personally feel a lot of pressure to somehow, be very androgynous or, wear dresses or something like that. I'm completely fine wearing male clothes and for all intents and purposes being a man in the world, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? And so it's also like, what is it supposed to mean anyways, right? What story do you have about what a man in the world is supposed to be, right? And is this Is this, like, what is it based on? You know? And so this the same thing too, is it's like the story you might tell yourself about diagnosis, right? Well, I'm starting to feel like it might be a good time to wrap up. There's just one other thing that came to mind in all this that I thought was kind of interesting on the topic of identity, is that I have this running theory when it comes to diagnosis and identity, and I've heard other people say it before, that the whole idea of accepting the identity can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? In that, if you really believe, because a lot of people talk about this whole placebo, nocebo effect, where if somebody believes that they have, they're seriously ill, they can make themselves seriously ill. And similarly, I was watching a video where a guy was talking about this stuff, that apparently a guy was getting cancer treatment, and he was trying an experimental thing, and he really believed this was going to work for him. And then he did the treatment, and he got into remission. It was doing great. It looked like it was really working. His doctor looked at the studies and then found out they've completely disproven that this treatment has any effectiveness at all. And he realized, wow, this guy's just having a remarkable placebo effect, because he really believes this treatment worked. The placebo is curing him of cancer. This is great. So he's like, well, I better not tell them that they found out about the drug. And so he was great for years, but then eventually this guy found the article that was proving this drug wasn't effective, and as soon as he had that belief undermined, that this was an effective treatment, then it all just went to shit, and he got cancer again, and, you know, it was bad news from there. But the thing is, that could also work for the other way around, whereas if somebody tells you, you know, you have bipolar, you have schizophrenia, and you've got to take this seriously and all this kind of stuff, the more you buy that, you know, if you really buy this model of, like, mania and depression or something like that, then, like, I don't have any, you know, hard evidence for this, but I would imagine it's when the mind has such a strong effect on the body that it can cure itself of cancer if the belief is strong enough. Then what about, this is stuff, this is mental health. This is the mind acting on the mind. It's just one, it's like a I mean, the mind and the body could be seen as one thing, but I mean, the mind and the mind is definitely one thing. So if you really believe that you're like, oh, well, you know, I might have a problem where I might get manic in the future. You know, I really believe this is a very serious, you know, it's a serious possibility I might become manic, and you've got a very strong idea of what mania is, then, you know, you're basically programming yourself to be manic by you're training your brain to be bipolar, right? And you could sub in any of these other ones for it. And so this is what's interesting, is that I was talking to my friend Liza, and she brought up this thing, there's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, and I won't sing the whole song, because that would be, like, I would just embarrass myself, basically. And it'd also be kind of, yeah, redundant, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if I was really that familiar with that song, but it was really tedious. But like, I didn't make it through I was watching like something on YouTube, where a little animation where these cartoon characters were singing it. But it's sort of like the guy's got a hole in his bucket, and then he's trying, and then they're trying to fix the hole in the bucket, but they get turned into a loop, because eventually, like, he needs to, you know, wind it up with string, and he needs to cut the string, and his axe to cut the string isn't sharp, and then, well, how is he going to, and he needs to sharpen it with a rock, but he needs to wet the rock. In order to wet the rock, he needs a bucket to carry water with, and then, oh shit, you know, it's like, I can't fix my bucket because my bucket is broken, right? And so it was, if you look, you can apply this to so many things, but if you look at what I'm talking about, identity, what people get into about this thing about diagnosis identity is people are like, well, if you think about what I said before about how by believing you're bipolar programs your brain to be bipolar, then it's just like, well, of course I'm bipolar because I have mania, so that makes me believe that I'm bipolar, and but they don't see that the fact that they believe that they're bipolar also creates the mania, right? And of course, it's it's kind of like the chicken and the egg thing too. And I guess people could say that, at first, obviously they would say that the bipolar or whatever it is a real phenomenon, because before that idea got introduced to them, something happened where they wound up in a psychiatrist's office or a hospital, and that thing that happened was mania. What I would say to that, though, is that it wasn't. Is that what it is undefinable. It is what it is. But then as soon as you start applying the labels onto it, you're taking something which goes beyond what we have words for, what we have labels for, and you start forming it into a form, right? And that's what when I first went to the hospital, I got labeled bipolar, and I was like, really? Because I didn't know much about bipolar, but I wouldn't think it would be like this, And like things about like what mood disorders, like everybody was big on me having like a mood disorder, and I'm like, well, people have moods, but the fact of my mood seems to be the least sort of, focused thing of what I've got going on for me. It's totally, I don't even know what any of these people were thinking. Like, what the fuck? Maybe it's probably because I quickly learned not to talk about too much of the weirder shit that was going on, because that would just get me more, ingrained in that being at odds with the psychiatry system. So I just shut up about that, and all they could really tell was that I was in a shitty mood because I had to fucking see the psychiatrist, basically. Which is like, I'm actually feeling pretty great now that I don't have to see a psychiatrist anymore. I'm kind of going off topic here, but that's the whole thing, is that like it's like if you have a rash, I did some good Mad Miracle articles about this too, but if you have a rash on your hand, it's sort of like, oh well, I wonder what causes this rash that I've got in my hand, right? And they're like, oh well, we've got this diagnosis for this certain rash, it's this kind of rash is causing the rash. And it's like, well, that's just a description of the rash. That doesn't actually say what causes it. And it's like, well, that's obviously what you've got, because look, you've got a rash in your hand. And it's like, well, you can't argue with that, right? But it still doesn't actually tell you what's going on. You just gave a name to the rash, And in that sense, I could name my rash Bob or Earl or something like that, and it would just be equally as valid, because you don't actually it's just a label, even with something like cancer, they don't understand it enough to cure it, but at least it's you can't, there's objectivity about it. There's whereas with a mental thing, the only objectivity is basically behavior, and that's just playing off of, but the thing is, behavior is not really objective, because in different contexts, things only get diagnosed because they're being viewed by a person who's job to diagnose things, and with behavior. If you take the same behavior in a completely other situation, it wouldn't be diagnosed. It would just be seen as something else. So really, the diagnosis is a subjective interpretation in the mind of somebody who's diagnosing, basically. Okay, well, I'll leave it off there. 40 minutes, good time. Okay.